So before we get to Cassie, we'll do what we normally do and just offer a short prayer, and then we'll go on to Cassie. So let us pray. Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who calls on us to pursue justice and loving kindness for all your children, our children. May these past 3 weeks command us to hold our educational and civic leaders accountable and to support those who do so, including an independent and free press. Lift up our teachers, school personnel, and all who urge us and lead us to make your beloved community our reality. Let us say amen. And now, Cassie Burke. Thanks for joining us, Cassie.
Thank you, Ira. That was lovely. Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. This is the new question you have. My name is Cassie Burke. I am the Bureau Chief of Chalkbeat Chicago. Prior to Chalkbeat, I was an assistant managing editor at Crane Chicago Business, if you're familiar with Cranes. And before that, I was at Chicago Magazine for 12 years, which was owned by the Tribune for the majority of the time. But I started my career 20 years ago as an education reporter at a small neighborhood paper, not neighborhood paper, but a small community newspaper in Georgia. And this was early in the days of No Child Left Behind. And at the time, education reporting was an entry beat in a lot of newsrooms. This was 20 years ago. And I had a lot of people when I left Cranes ask me why I was going back to education reporting. And I said at the time, and I still believe it, that it is the most important beat. And this was before COVID has really put into stark relief a lot of the inequities we see in the system. But one of the reasons for me it is the most important beat is I also have 4 children. My stepson is in college. My 2 elementary age children are in CPS, and then I have a preschooler. So my view of the system is actually quite interesting since I have a 3-year-old and a 20-year-old and then 2 children in the middle. So it has really brought into focus how important public education is and at every level that we're having these conversations. So that's a little bit about me today. So that may give you a little bit of a sense of how I approach this, both as a journalist and as a parent in public schools. I launched Chalkbeat Chicago in 2018. We are part of a national network of nonprofit newsrooms that cover public education. At the time, Chicago was the 7th bureau. We have since launched Philadelphia, but we are the next to youngest bureau. And I launched it by myself and added staff along the way. I now have 3 reporters who work for me, 2 of whom cover Chicago, 1 of whom covers the state, and then I cover early education, which is not really in something I'm going to talk about as much today, but I'm happy to answer questions about it because it's a vastly undercovered realm of public education. So quickly, what is Chalkbeat? We are a nonprofit news outlet. I think it's always important to share how we're funded. We are funded by job boards, event sponsorships, grants from large philanthropic organizations, and donations from readers, similar to how NPR would be, or WBEZ. And we have 8 bureaus. And we also have a national desk that focuses on federal education policy and also education research. And this is a really important aspect of what we do. Our coverage is grounded in research and evidence-based findings. And so that's just a really important thing that I would stress about our coverage. Our website, chalkbeat.org, and our Chicago bureau is chicago.chalkbeat.org is free. And so anybody can go onto the website, anybody can read our content, and also anybody can use our content. So we have partner arrangements with Block Club Chicago, the Sun-Times has run our content, Patch frequently runs our content. So you'll see our stories pop up in other places. One of the things we did in the very beginning was when we launched the Chicago Bureau, we had a series of 9 conversations with different communities across the city. And one of the things that we were asking was what's missing from the discussion about Chicago public schools. And at this dinner that I hosted at Diet High School, this is on the South Side, this is the site of the hunger strike, if you recall that, during the school closings under Mayor Rahm Emanuel. One of the things I heard really stuck with me, and it was this quote: there's a disconnect between the policymakers and the people on the ground. Too often, I have to bring my own chair to the table. And this was a parent. And I think that view was a common view that we heard throughout the time in 2018. And one of the things that we have tried to do is create a conversation space that is rooted in fact, that is rooted in evidence, but is also rooted in experience. And so we really focus on getting voices of parents and students and educators into our coverage. So from the time we started until this past March, when schools closed because of COVID-19, we had different policy areas we focused on. But a lot of the things that we covered came back to this. And here's a chart that shows NWEA math attainment. So what that is, it's a standardized test. Probably a lot of you are familiar with it. Chicago gives it at many schools 3 times a year. And it assesses a student's comprehension of math and reading concepts. And so what we saw, and it could be a graduation rate graph, it could be a freshman on track graph. But what we saw was that there were large attainment gaps between the students in the system who were white and Asian, and the students who were Latino, and the students who were Black. And one of the things that we had started to see more recently was that while the district was starting to close the gaps largely for Latino students and for Black students, that the gaps were starting to widen again. And one of the things we were trying to understand was why that is. A place that we were focused in particular was in literacy and in reading. We did this story in December of 2018, and it was a story called How It Feels to Be Javion, 16 and Struggling to Read in Chicago Public Schools. And this was a story that it was about one boy, but knowing that literacy rates in Chicago, that about 3 in 10 adults struggle with literacy in Chicago, we felt like this story represented maybe some of the reasons that we saw. And this was a child who had an IEP, which meant he had an individualized education plan, that he had a disability, but it was a little hard to pinpoint exactly what that was. He was also a child whose mother had died. He had been in and out of foster care. He was being cared for. He had a foster parent. And that he had been shuttled around to schools. And each time he went to a new school, it was sort of like he started over. And each time he went to a new school, there was then a new assessment of what he needed. There was time that it took to kind of rally around him. It wasn't clear that was always happening. And our reporter spent quite a bit of time with Javion and would just sit down and read with him. And what Javion would say was in this quote box, "I can read some of it, but I can't read all of it. I need help." And he was very clear that he needed help. But what wasn't clear to us was how he was getting the help. And one of the things that one of his case managers had said to us is, we're feeling that this is not a reflection of his ability, but it's more of an issue of things that he missed early on in his education. That because he had had this traumatic event in his life, because he had been shuttled around to different schools, that maybe it hadn't even been caught for a really long time. And so now here he was, 16, and really struggling to read a basic passage in a story. And these are the types of stories that I think are really important to elevate to the public, to try to start to understand why students are not students fall through the cracks and what's happening. And you see in cases like this that there's a lot of small steps along the way, things that happened, but that each time this child went to a different school, he had to start over. We don't have a centralized reading curriculum in Chicago. Each school does things its own way. And then you have issues with special education. So I think that these are just important stories to understand. So along the time in the year, we also spent time talking to students. And this is a short video we made actually during the mayoral election, the last city election. And this was a video we made hearing from students about their experiences in schools. And I wanted to share it with you today just so you could hear the voices of students, because I think in the heart of our coverage, that's really where we try to focus, or what are the student experiences and what are they telling us? So I will play this just shortly.
One thing I like about my school is that it's such a tight-knit community, and everyone knows everyone and feels like a family. I've met so many people from multiple different backgrounds that all have really amazing stories that are all very different, with which I didn't really get in middle school.
It is an international school, so there's people come from all over the world.
We have our own library inside of the school. We have a basement where the gym is, and we have the swimming pool. It's really fun to walk around, and it's like has a lot of secret doors.
It's very calming, like you feel accepted there.
Chicago Public Schools is a system with some promising opportunities and some serious challenges. Our city's next mayor will have to wrestle with them all. This year, Chicago will educate more than 361,000 students. That's 77,275 students less than in 2002. In addition, enrollment has dropped 10,000 since just last fall, particularly among students of color. Meanwhile, graduation rates have hit historic highs, and more students than ever are going to college. A lot of decisions will have to be made, and there are competing interests. So we asked the people affected by the decisions the most, students. What would you say to Chicago's next mayor?
But I would tell the next mayor that we need more funding for schools that need them desperately, like on the south side. My school at Hancock is it's a very old building. It's falling apart. Our school is getting a new building, but I really feel like that funding for the school would really help not only education, but making sure the building is maintained.
A lot of kids at my school in particular are having issues with transportation to and from school.
We struggle with giving fair education.
Please fund the CPS system more. I mean, I go to one of the best considered schools in the CPS system, and we still have paper shortages, teacher shortages. I didn't get a Spanish teacher until the first quarter was over this year.
My school, we don't even have a field. We don't even have air conditioning. I would tell the next mayor to listen to the students. We have a lot of opinions and different things that we want to say and voice more than just in our schools, but elsewhere.
My message to the next mayor is they need to put students first.
So clearly there's a point in time that's happening there. It's before the mayoral election. But I think a lot of the things the students say still resonate. So that's why I wanted to share that with you. I also wanted to share that there's a lot of reasons why Chicago Public Schools is a very promising system. And so I wanted to make sure that I framed our conversation that way. There are actually a lot of exciting things that are happening within the school district. But I think the thing we have to also recognizes there's a lot of challenges. So I put this slide in. Kind of progressing along our year, we had been up and running about a little bit more than a year. And then there started to be clear signs of labor unrest between the city's teachers union and the district. So we spent a lot of last fall covering the teacher strike, which closed Chicago Public Schools for 11 days, and also ushered in $1.5 billion in additional costs that the district is going to have to meet across the next 5 years. So the really pivotal moment in the system. But still along that way, we were really focused on efforts to improve schools. And so we were covering stories such as equity grants for under-enrolled schools. So this is a new pot of money, or it's a new grant program that the district is giving schools with under-enrollment additional money. Training for restorative justice, reduction in suspensions and expulsions, programs to try to partner nonprofit community organizations with high-need schools. That was something that was really brought to the forefront actually in the negotiations for the strike, for the collective bargaining deal between the union and the district. And that's an interesting program that we were trying to follow up on and see what evidence was that it was working. And then grants for new programs such as STEM programs and International Baccalaureate, which is a British curriculum that is popular with parents. It was also fairly rigorous and that more schools have been adding. And this is a way the district has tried to attract more students to neighborhood schools I know in some of your earlier discussions, you've talked about selective enrollment schools and neighborhood schools. So these are some of the efforts that the district was putting into trying to bolster neighborhood schools in particular. But all of this is to say then COVID happened. And that's a definite shift. I don't probably need to tell any of you that in education and kind of the trajectory of what we were seeing happen in Chicago public schools. All of a sudden, all of the effort and all of the attention that was being paid to closing these achievement gaps and bolstering neighborhood schools and trying to come to some sort of peace and resolution with the teachers union after a pretty bitter teacher strike, all ground to a halt. And schools closed on March 17th of 2020. I remember that day because I cried, I think, half the day as a parent. And I think it was very clear at the time, even then, the writing was on the wall that students were not going to go back for spring. And as you all know, students have also not gone back this fall. And they're learning from home and they're learning virtually. And the district has pledged to improve remote learning. By many accounts, it is going better. Parents generally say it is going better. But without a doubt, remote learning is not a substitute for in-person learning. No one thinks it is. The research doesn't think it is. And so we are in this moment where the gaps between students we've talked about earlier, the concern is, and the evidence is starting to show us that those gaps are going to only start to widen again. So what are the stories that we're covering now? And I'll go through these and then I hope to open up to discussion and we can just spend the rest of the time with discussion. What are the specific stories that we're covering now? We have a lot of them. One of the things we're covering is attendance and access. And so we kind of break that up in a few different ways. Access to internet, access to devices. That's a storyline we followed very closely with the city's Chicago Connected program. That's a program that aims to connect 100,000 students to broadband internet for 4 years. It's underwritten by grants and some city money. It's been slow to get off the ground. 38,000 students were connected as of this past Tuesday. That's about a third of the city's goal. So that's one area. Another area is attendance. Who's showing up and who's not? First day of Chicago Public Schools, 49,000 students didn't show up that were expected. By the end of the week, that number had been dramatically decreased down to about 7,000. They continue to connect with students. They have it down to the lower thousands now. But again, showing up every day doesn't necessarily mean students are staying on. And I think that's a really important proxy for what's happening since we don't have the same assessment data to look at learning as we have traditionally had, since schools are not generally giving assessments. Another place we're really looking and spending a lot of our energy is the impact on the city's most vulnerable students. This picture is a young woman named Sarah. She goes to a charter school on the South Side. In the spring, we did this story. And stories like this, I think, really show the burdens on students. Not only are they trying to study for their SAT, Sarah was trying to take care of 2 younger brothers, one of whom has autism. She was also trying to work, and then her charter closed. And so I think that you again see that there are all of these, going back to the Javion story, that students have all of these challenges and that one policy solution is not going to be enough for any of them. Another thing we've focused a lot on is special education and the experience of students who have IEPs and who have disabilities and their experience in the system. Right now we have a survey in the field just talking to special education parents, and in particular Latino special education, Latino families who are often very underrepresented in that coverage, to see what are their experiences. Are they getting connected with services? And I also included a link here. I can send all of these links to you, Ira. I also included a link here. It's not ours, but there's an incredible story the New Yorker ran last week about the students left behind by remote learning that just looks at, again, the experience of one little boy who gets shuffled. This is in Baltimore, but he gets shuffled between families. We hear about this experience a lot. And I think it's important to remember that not every child has a consistent place where they sit down and they try to log in virtually, and that grandparents, aunts, uncles, random neighbors, sometimes daycare facilities are all overseeing this experience, and that it's inconsistent at best for some students and not happening at all for others. Other things that we're tracking, new patterns for enrollment in the video that we showed, you saw that enrollment, Chicago Public Schools was already a district seeing enrollment declines. That's not uncommon among the large urban districts. They were starting to see declines too. Chicago's declines were a little bit more dramatic. But we're seeing enrollment declines already in younger children in every district we cover. And there's a thought that Chicago will likely, we haven't seen those numbers yet, but Chicago will likely experience the same thing. There's some parents with young children who are just opting out completely. And what is that going to do to the city's public school enrollment? And that translates to public school funding. So that's a really important thing that we're watching. We're also trying to pay attention to budget pressures on the district. We've covered the district's budget each year. This year is a particularly interesting year because they're trying to balance the budget on more COVID relief from Congress. Those of you who followed the CARES Act and what Congress has been doing knows that there's a second stimulus relief effort, but it has stalled. There's starting to be some momentum we're seeing this weekend, but CPS is counting on that money coming through, and that's a gamble. We're also seeing at the state a frozen budget line for schools. And we can talk about state policy and state funding for schools. It's a really important part of the calculus for Chicago Public Schools. But when the state doesn't put extra money into schools, that essentially means schools lose money because, again, going back to the agreement with the union, it costs more to operate a school district every single year. And so if the money coming in from the state is flat, and that is the largest funding source for Chicago Public Schools, then that essentially is a cut for CPS. And I included this. I just thought this was interesting. We did a story about what districts were decisions they were starting to make because of flat funding in the middle of COVID. And this is a district in Western Illinois. It's not even Chicago. But the thing the superintendent wanted to cut, he's scaling back on summer school math and reading coaches. And again, when you talk about vulnerable students, these are the things that vulnerable students need. And so these are the things that he has to cut. He can't cut his teacher salaries. He can't cut the cost of powering his schools, even though nobody's in them. So I think that this is a really important thing to stress. The other thing that we're really focused on, and this to me is the most important question, is what is the impact on learning? What is happening to students? Are they learning? What are they learning? And what sort of, how are we going to assess the losses and what are we going to do about it when school buildings finally reopen? This is a story we did that really looked, a reporter embedded in one school, Curie High School. This is on the southwest side. It's the third largest high school in Chicago. And just really looked at the springtime, really a deep look at remote learning there and what the experiences of students and educators was. And it's a really powerful story. And it shows what efforts and what lengths schools are going to reach students. It's just any sort of thing they can do to find them and to try to keep them connected. Because again, the battle isn't necessarily just getting the student to log on, it's getting the student to stay connected and to participate. And it also looks at some of the challenges. One of the student actually who's pictured here in the red shirt, the person who's sort of obscured in the photo is one of her nieces or cousins, and she was taking care at sometimes of 5 different children while she was trying to do her own remote learning because the parents were trying to work. And so there's a moment in the story where she has an assignment that's due and she can't get it done. And the nieces have watched Frozen a million times because that's all she can think of to do with them. And she just breaks into tears. And she's like, I can't do this. And she's trying to graduate. And she did graduate, by the way. She did get her assignment in. But I think that just what students' experiences are, it's just each student has just a long, many layers of things that they're dealing with. So that's my presentation. I would love to open it up to discussion, questions you'd like to ask, or just as important, questions you think that we should be asking. I also included my email address if you ever have any questions you'd just like to direct to me, and also my Twitter handle. We're pretty active on social media, so that's always a good place to share, to to see what we're doing and support us. And also, I would just say that I think supporting independent journalism is really important in this space. We used to have a newspaper, the Chicago Tribune, that had a huge education desk. It had education editors. It's now down to, I think there's one person covering CPS. I think that we've seen over time just a dramatic decrease in the number of journalists who are covering education. And in Chicago, we are fortunate. We do have still the Tribune, the Sun-Times, and WBEZ, and now Chalkbeat. But I think that this is just a critical space to have reporters and have accountability for how money is being spent and for how decisions are being made. So thank you. And would love to hear your questions or comments or thoughts.
Thank you, Cassie. We have one question so far in the chat, and just a clarification on who receives IEPs, and maybe just a little bit of elaboration on that point.
Sure. So IEPs are individual education plans, and those are plans that are drafted for students who have a disability. In Chicago Public Schools, that is about 15% of the student population. And that could be everything from a physical disability to a learning disability, to both. And in Chicago Public Schools, you have some students who have IEPs who are in the regular school population. Every school has children with IEPs. So they are in classes with students who don't have IEPs. And then Chicago also has some specialized schools for students who have more complex and severe disabilities, including physical disabilities. And if you remember, in the spring before schools closed, actually the first Chicago school to have COVID cases released publicly and that closed early was one of those schools, was a school on the north side that serves students with complex disabilities. And that was really a critical moment. Because those students have some of those students are medically fragile.
Great, thank you. And another question, what is CPS doing to appeal to the parents who have and are considering, oh wait, can you talk a little bit, it's jumping around here. Can you talk a little bit more about Chicago Connected? And that's the program that gets donations for increased broadband.
Yeah, I'm happy to. We've covered this really closely. So Chicago Connected, it was really interesting. One of the things that one of the strengths of Chalkbeat is that we are able to see what's happening in other cities. I think sometimes in education policy, there's this very bubble that happens in different places, and everybody is worried about the challenges in the one city that you're in, but yet different districts experience a lot of the same challenges. And certainly during COVID, the decisions about remote learning were the same decisions were being made in other places. And so in Chalkbeat, we meet every day. And so the bureau chief in New York, in Detroit, in Denver, Indianapolis, we all sit down, we talk about what's going on. And one of the things we noticed actually really early on was that other cities were making these Herculean efforts to deploy hotspots and buses with routers and and super spots and all of these things to help children get access. And Chicago was eerily quiet on this point. And we actually pointed that out in a few stories that we did. And it turned out, and so to be fair, Chicago did deploy hotspots to about 12,000 students who were homeless or in temporary living situations, but it really didn't have a broader internet policy until late in the summer. And that was a point that was starting to become very concerning among community advocates and education advocates. But what it did come up with was actually a very thorough, or what appears to be a fairly thorough plan. It involves different philanthropies in the city, the large providers, so Comcast and RCN, and then community organizations. And so essentially it's spending about $50 million over the next 4 years to connect families, low-income families, with 4 years of free broadband internet. And so the goal was an ambitious goal. It was 100,000 students, about, I think, 60,000 households. And for whatever reason, it rolled it out at the beginning of August and was really relying on community organizations who know the languages in the neighborhoods, who know how to reach people to help spread the word and help get people to sign up. And for whatever reason, the signups have been slower than I think they maybe intended. So you have about 38,000 students connected through the program right now, according to the city. One of the things that's come up is, one of the barriers that's come up is people don't trust a free deal. And that the way that it's been marketed and the way people are marketed to all the time, I mean, we all know right? Everybody's always trying to sell you something, give you something for free, but there's a bait and switch. That families distrusted the deal. That also families who had outstanding bills, there was some sort of barrier to sign up there. There are also concerns from families that are undocumented, and we see this a lot, that families who are undocumented are afraid to sign up for things like this because they're afraid that it will trip the public charge rule, which is a rule that can affect their status. And this doesn't do that, but there's just a fear there. So that's some of the reasons we're seeing why maybe families are not signing up for this plan as quickly as maybe the hope was. That was a long answer, but I think Chicago Connected is actually a really important part of what's happening right now.
Thank you. And another question, what is CPS doing to appeal to the parents who have and are considering opting out? Maybe you can even explain what that concept is in your answer.
That's a really good question. And I'm going to be honest that I don't see what they're doing. It doesn't mean they're not doing something. I don't know what it is. What opting out is, so what we're seeing, and we're seeing this in other cities, is that parents of young children especially, so pre-K, kindergarten, and to a certain extent first grade, but mainly pre-K and kindergarten, are just saying we're bagging this year. They are not necessarily homeschooling. They're not necessarily going to private schools. They're just not, period. And so we've seen steep enrollment declines of up to 10% in kindergarten in some other states. The thought here, I did a story maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago talking to pre-K educators. It must have only been about 2 weeks ago. And they were all anecdotally saying they had fewer children on their rosters. So these aren't families that signed up and didn't come. They're just families that didn't sign up. And the thought is that they just can't, working families, again, going back to a lot of families, what we see anecdotally, are shuffling their kids between different sites. So Monday they're at grandma's, Tuesday they're at their aunt's, Wednesday they're at a neighbor's, Thursday there's an older sibling. Those families don't feel like they can keep up with the day-to-day of remote learning and what it would require. And also their schedules are changing every week. They're asking different providers. These are families who are working outside the home. I mean, we've built a whole remote learning apparatus as a country based on the presumption that parents are sitting at home able to do this. And that's just not the case. I mean, some parents are working and juggling it at home and doing a subpar job. That would be my case, and I'll admit it. But there's a lot of parents who still have to go to their jobs. They have to clean the hotels. They have to, work in the restaurants. They have to work at the airport. So they're just shuffling their kids around, and they can't take on this responsibility. They're not able to. And so they're just logging out of the system entirely.
Cassie, I have a follow-up on that question, and it never really occurred to me, but under the laws of educating children, I guess, I mean, isn't it mandatory to send your kid to school? And if you don't send them to school, then you have to homeschool them? Or if you homeschool, do you have to report to the authorities that you're homeschooling? And then where's the accountability, for lack of a better word, for those families that just say, we're not doing school this year?
Really interesting twist. In Illinois, kindergarten is not compulsory, and neither is pre-K. So they can just opt out. Illinois is one of several states that, and there have been efforts in the legislature to try to have a requirement that children attend kindergarten here, but it has never passed. So there is no. With older children, there is that's a different sort of thing. But in this moment, we don't see quite the dedicated effort to follow up on that in this moment.
So, well, pre-K and kindergarten are not legally required, but
right.
Required for older students?
Required for older students, but who's in the follow-up?
Right. So there's and then if you just can't get blood from a stone either. So
yeah, I mean, if you can't find families.
Okay. Well, thank you. Good question. What nonprofits are engaged in supporting CPS students?
There are a lot. There are a lot of nonprofits. So CPS has its own philanthropic arm called the Children's First Fund, but then there's also a long list of nonprofits that are engaged with schools that are, I mentioned earlier, there was a program that was kind of gaining steam in the city that partnered one nonprofit with a school and gave them money, gave them pretty significant grants to try to tackle a problem at the school and work together. And these were community-based nonprofits. And so one thing would be to try to build out a stronger STEM program, or to try to recruit more students for attendance, or to, there were all these sorts of things that were happening. And those have largely been, I think, in the era of everything moving virtual, we've lost sight on those programs. And I think the nonprofits themselves have taken a hit during this time, is what we understand. But some of the nonprofits, and one that we work with, or that we talk to quite frequently, is called Communities in Schools. And that's one of these organizations that help partner nonprofits with schools and tries to help them. And one way they've stepped up in this moment is, how do you find students? And so they staff social workers, they staff some positions at schools. And so really creating a network of people who are going around trying to find students who've fallen off for whatever reason.
And we have a couple of questions about the length of the school day. And some of them kind of touch on the point that we're experiencing in our family, which is the school day had been starting at 9 and going till 3:30, and now they switched it to 8 o'clock, I guess because of a district mandate. So is there any discussion that you're aware of that, whether that works or not, whether that's too much time in front of a screen, or how does that play into state requirements and district requirements, and any solutions being talked about there?
Really, really good question. Let's unpack it a little bit. So the state does require a minimum amount of time. And the state requirements vary by grade. The state requirements are, CPS did go above the state requirements, and not in a crazy amount, not substantially, but it does require more than the state. And the school's chief, Janice Jackson, was pretty clear throughout the summer, and definitely once the plan shifted fully to remote learning, that she did not want to see the academic gains that the district had made slip, and that students were going to be spending a full day doing learning. And you've seen in school board meetings and in there's a change.org petition and a lot of conversation among parents that this is too much time. But what we have found in our own reporting is that there are parents who feel like that is not, I will say, that is not a thought that is shared by all parents. And that there are concerns, especially for working parents. What do you do with the kids if they're not on the screen doing something? And that in some ways that this is a way to address concerns about the learning losses that we've talked about, and also try to address some concerns of working parents. There is certainly an outcry that it is too much, particularly among younger children. And in one of my kids' schools, they have actually just changed around the day completely, which I thought was interesting. Basically front loading reading and math in the morning when the kids are fresher, and then in the afternoon, again, one of mine is only 5, in the afternoon doing things like PE and art, things that are maybe better for like a lagging attention span and get them up and moving. And then there's also a lot of encouragement to do, 30 minutes on the screen, turn the screen off and do 30 minutes away, and do that sort of thing. So you see schools that are starting to, I think all schools are trying to look at this and adjust where they can, but the district does have requirements that they spend, certain numbers of so many minutes, depending on the grade, doing live instruction, and then also activities outside of that.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. One question is about those families that, because they have more than one child at home, maybe many children at home, they have to share broadband. They may not have more than one computer. How are those families being accommodated, if they are at all?
Really good question. So one thing I did not talk about was the district also, in advance of Chicago Connected, which is the broadband program, The district did say, we are going to give out as many as devices as we like possibly can. And so early on, they said, we're going to give out 100,000 devices. And then that number even grew. I don't even know what the total count is right now, but it was over 120,000 the last time I looked. And that mix of devices that they basically combed through schools and got existing fleets of Chromebooks. They did some purchases. We've tracked actually those purchases really closely. That's been one of our areas of focus. We've teamed up with the Better Government Association to look at that spending, which is actually really interesting. And they have purchased additional iPads and Chromebooks predominantly, and then given them out to students. And the district has said, okay, you're in a household, you have siblings, we want to make sure everybody has a device. And principals have been, from what we've seen, really working to make sure every child in a household has a device. They're not using mom's mobile phone. That was what a lot of what we were seeing in the spring. Every child had something. Now, it sort of opens up new questions. What's the quality of that device? Can that device run the, the video meets that the students are supposed to do? What happens if it gets a cracked screen? We knew that there were some cases that students got handed devices that had some sort of flaw with them or had a cracked screen, and parents had to then go back and figure it all out. So I think the device issue is not a one and done sort of story. We can't just say, well, the district gave out the devices, problem solved. I think that this opens up a whole new realm of responsibility for the district, and that it has to also have a way of handling troubleshooting and repair and all of those things. So it's a really interesting question.
Okay. I had a question that beyond COVID, see what your thoughts were on that. What is what's the verdict on the closing of the 50 schools under Emmanuel? Was it a necessary, smart decision? What have been the long-term effects of that? Do you see any possibility of reopening any of those schools or doing other approaches, based on that? Because the mayor made it sound like had to be done. This was, for there was just no money to keep them open. They weren't viable. A lot of people disagree with that. Now that we've had some time to think about it and see, what's your sense?
That's a really complicated question. I think there's a few things that I would say here. Number one, I think it's important. When I think about this question, I get asked this question. I always think about a student I met, and I met her sometime early in 2019, and she went to a small high school on the South Side. She wanted to go to the University of Chicago. She wanted to actually be the first female student from her high school, which was just a few miles from the University of Chicago, to actually get to go there. But there was something holding her back, and it was that her school didn't offer calculus. Her school didn't offer calculus because when you have high schools that get so small, they can't afford to have teachers who have those specialties. They can't afford to have some of the things that we take for granted with our children who go to high schools that are better funded. They don't have all of the extracurriculars, they don't have all the sports, and they also don't have all of the academics. In Chicago, we have seen a dramatic decline in enrollment. We are operating a school district based on a size of student population that we haven't seen in more than a decade. There are schools on the South Side and the West Side that have 50 kids, high schools. The math doesn't work. Even if you have equity grants, even if you're giving those schools additional money, how is that going to pay for a calculus teacher? How is that going to pay for those things? I think that the debate about school closings, and they are very traumatic to communities. There's a lot of research that shows how much trauma was caused by the school closings. There's also not been any evidence that the district saved any money by doing it. So I think, I have to also stress, but the reason why this is so complicated is that I don't think any of us can sit here and argue that a high school with 50 students is meeting the needs of those students. At high school, at that level, at prepping kids for whether it's college or for a trade school or for the military, whatever it is, the numbers don't work. The math doesn't work. And Chicago is going to have to continue to make these decisions because we continue to see schools that have under 100 enrolled kids. And this is a conversation nobody wants to have. The union doesn't want to have it. The district doesn't want to have it. One of the hardest stories I wrote was actually the beginning of this year in January, and it was about this problem. And I got pushback from every single person in policy. Nobody wanted to talk to me about it. Nobody wants to have the conversation.
Yeah, and I was going to ask this question too as a follow-up. Donna mentioned that students can take higher level classes like calculus at online community colleges. Does that happen a lot?
You're seeing the city, city colleges starting to enroll more students in dual credit programs. So I think you're seeing that happen. But I don't get the sense that was necessarily solving the issue. And there's some kids that's not the best way. I mean, now that's the way they're learning, but maybe that wasn't the best way they learned, or maybe there wasn't a mechanism for them to do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Jim Garner has a question about enrollment and senses that the ability for parents to work remotely who have jobs in the city, now that they can work remotely, maybe they're moving out of the city, and how does that affect funding and per pupil budgeting, competition for students, lower tax base?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. We typically see enrollment numbers. Chicago does something called 20th day enrollment. And so it generally releases numbers after the 20th day, arguing that gives time for the no-shows to come, and that gives them time to even out the enrollment. And so that's generally after that day, we generally get those numbers, but there's a delay. We haven't seen them yet. Certainly in like real estate, in the real estate market, you've heard a lot of discussion about families moving out. I've seen mixed evidence on it, actually. So I don't know. I think it'll be interesting to see what we see. Chicago was barely hanging on to the title of third largest school district. Miami-Dade was just like right on our heels last year. And so it will be interesting. That's one shift we'll be looking for, is does Chicago actually even drop in the ranks in terms of the size of the public school district, recognizing that other districts, including Miami-Dade, are having the same challenges. Students are also dropping out there. Parents are also moving out of the city. Anecdotally, we're hearing that. So we'll see how that shakes out.
Okay. And just to keep things moving, I'm presenting the questions, but if anyone who has asked these questions in chat want to ask a follow-up or elaborate on their question, feel free to hop in. Craig is asking, how do charter schools enter into the equation, and are they siphoning off funds and kids from CPS?
Really good question. So just to back up and give you context, if you're not familiar, Chicago is a system that is about 1 in 5 schools is a charter school in Chicago. And the charter schools tend to be more concentrated on the south and west sides. The charter schools, we have an interesting sort of menu of charter schools here. We have some of the big players. So we have Noble, for example, which is the state's largest charter system. We have KIPP, which is a national charter operator, but we also have a lot of what we call mom and pop charters. So those are just single sites, 1 or 2 charters. And so the charter picture is always a little hard to see fully, because the charters aren't required to report the same data and in the same ways as the public school district, which is one thing, is if you're an education reporter, is a constant sort of irritation. We have seen the charters actually in virtual learning adopting some different approaches. There are some charters in Chicago that are bringing their children back into buildings. And their argument is the argument that people across the city are making, that remote learning doesn't work for their student population. They can't address their students' needs consistently. We see other charters that are doing all virtual learning in the moment. In terms of enrollment, enrollment for charters has been largely steady. There was a little bit of a decline last year. Chicago was very aggressive on charters about a decade ago, and a bunch of them opened. That has largely, that sort of impetus, for lack of a better word, or that it has flattened. We have a mayor who's pledged to not open additional charters. Politically, charters have become something that are closely scrutinized. And so we don't see the same sort of growth in charters that we did before. Now, during remote learning, I think it will be interesting to see, did we see any sort of shift in their enrollment? Because there were some charters that were very aggressive on the ground, saying like, spring was a mess. We can do a better job. Here's an iPad. Come over here. And so we did see that. Whether that will translate to an uptick in enrollment or just flat enrollment, we don't know yet.
Thanks. I have another question. It seems to me the popular depiction of how the school CPS is run is that it's an adversarial system between the teachers union and the administration. I mean, the way I look at it, you've got this kind of corporate bureaucratic district versus, for lack of a better word, a socialist minded teachers union. And where's the middle ground there? Is the model the way they operate, the way they talk, the way they come up with solutions? Do you think that it's a generally good system, or is anyone talking about ways to maybe make it less adversarial and more collaborative? Or is it already collaborative and we're just not hearing about that because the media likes to portray things in terms of conflict?
That's a really good question. I think from a few things here. It's a hard question to answer. I do think, again, going back to the fact that every day I'm on conversations with the bureau chief in New York and the bureau chief in Denver and the bureau chief in Detroit, I do see that there are other cities where the unions and the administration seem to have a more productive conversation. I think that we have seen, especially in remote learning, there are cities where the union has had an agreement, that there's been an agreement that was worked out. Even in New York, it was at the 11th hour and it changed twice, but there was an agreement that was worked out. And we have not seen that in Chicago. I think that there are a lot of things that come into play here. I think mayoral control of schools is a factor. In the political relationship, it gets triangulated between the mayor, the schools chief, and the union. So I think that's one issue here. Opens up a whole separate conversation, but I think that that's one issue we see. We also see that unions protect teachers. Their job is to protect teachers. Their job is to protect teachers' salaries. And in any time you have a district that is losing enrollment, that is losing children, they have to make the case to keep the staffing levels flat, and I think, or increase. And I think there's a natural tension there when you don't have enough money in the system. Again, going back to state funding being low, Illinois, we have not historically funded our schools in the way other states have. I think anytime you have fewer resources and people feel like they're fighting over fewer resources, you're going to have conflict. And that's the situation that we see here, and we see it time and time again. Does it serve students? At the end of the day, does this conflict serve students? And that's the question I always come back to. And I think that at the end of the day, it's hard to see that it does.
We're almost out of time. I just had one more question, which is what can we on this call be doing, be thinking, be advocating for, whatever it is? What would you say your number one, maybe one or two suggestions for just folks like us to make a difference?
That's a really good question, and I wish I had a really good answer for it. I think that I do think that looking to see where the conversation is happening and where it's not happening is important. I think school funding is a really important place for conversation. I think that thinking about how districts, not just Chicago, have historically been underfunded by the state is an important thing to understand and to discuss. I also think thinking about students first. What are things that serve students? And sorry, that's a little bit of an ambiguous answer for you, but I think organizations that serve students and supporting organizations that serve students is really important. And also supporting organizations that work with schools on the South and West Side.
Okay. Well, it is 10:31 right now. We've made it, I didn't mention this before, but we can kind of keep the conversation going informally, whether you, Cassie, are able to stay with us or, we can just do it. I don't know what your schedule is like. There is an 11 o'clock service. and maybe coffee hour as well, virtual coffee hour. But I'll keep the line open for a while if anyone has any further questions. Claudia Jackson mentions that we should just stay all informed, and Chalkbeat Chicago is a fabulous resource. Thank you, Cassie and Chalkbeat, for all you do. I will just make a pitch again. Cassie took time out of her schedule, busy family life and work life, to educate us. And just a reminder again, I personally made a donation because I felt that it was important to acknowledge her time here today. You know, that's something you might want to all consider as well. We're getting a lot of thank yous coming through. Melanie, maybe you can hold your question for the informal session at this point. So Cassie, thank you again. Thank you everyone on the call for joining us, and we will see you at future sessions in adult education. Hope you have a good weekend.
Thanks for having me, Ira.
Bet.
That was a good conversation. You know, one thing I would say, I know people are dropping off, but one thing I would say is that I do think there's a sense that people don't care about public schools unless they have children in them. And I don't think that's true, but I do think there's that sentiment out there. And I think just like following the coverage, voicing an opinion when you have it, really trying to show that people care about what happens in education, because it affects all of us, I think that matters. I know that's, again, sort of ambiguous, but I do think that that's that sort of sense that there's only a demographic that cares about education in the city. I don't think that's true.
Yeah, it's a basic infrastructure, it seems to me, for lack of a better word. And you know, it's health of our city and safety, just all sorts of stuff. I was wondering too, like, what do you see as the federal role in education, especially now? And is the federal role, is there a federal role these days? I mean, we're just not hearing much, I don't think. Maybe it's because everyone's talking about everything else under the sun except for education. But I mean, other than an occasional controversy from the education secretary, it just seems like there's no real plan. And I don't know if that's needed, or is the philosophy just keep it to the states and local, or does the federal government need to be stepping up here?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, historically, the federal government only funds about 10% of local education. So the federal government does more, you know, I gave the example at the beginning of No Child Left Behind, and then you had sort of the Arne Duncan years when you had Race to the Top. The federal government will set basically accountability policy and encourage states, you know, carrot or stick sort of encouragement to set different learning standards, and you have the Common Core, you have sort of a policy level approach, but you don't see the federal government getting involved as much in the local decision making in education historically. During the Trump administration, you know, Betsy DeVos has been his education secretary, who's from Michigan, has been an outspoken supporter of school choice, and so you've seen things like charters and vouchers for private education definitely become part of the conversation again, which has been interesting. One thing we have seen during the COVID time is that the DeVos administration has pushed for both districts to use their emergency spending dollars. So districts got a bunch of emergency money, right? Recognizing COVID's going to cost you money. You got to buy PPE and you got to sanitize your schools. And so the government gave schools emergency money. And DeVos basically said, you have to share that money with the private schools. And that conversation got thrown into court over how much. And that's been an interesting policy turn. The other place the DeVos administration or the Trump administration, I think, has started to play a role is telling districts, you have to assess your students this year. Like, we are not going to give out waivers for you to avoid standardized testing this year like we did in the spring. And that's sort of setting the stage for some conflict. You're already hearing some union discussion about that. Like, how can we assess students when they're not learning traditionally? How do we even give an assessment? But the DeVos administration so far has said we are not going to waive that. Now, how will that be affected by a November election, by the outcome of an election? I think is a really interesting question. Education policy, again, on the federal level, you know, when you're in debates, when you're seeing Biden and Trump, you know, education isn't the thing that's coming to the top in this election cycle. And so the Biden administration, it's a little unclear to me, just personally, where they stand on some of these issues. But we are covering that on our national desk.
Mm-hmm. Melanie, did you have a question?
I guess I wanted to ask about this conversation. I appreciate Chalkbeat so much. I'm starting my 18th year teaching math. I've taught it to really, I've just been lucky to teach it to really high demand selective enrollment high schools. I am the calculus teacher you just mentioned. And I guess I wanted to clarify that it is one giant math problem when it comes to funding, but it's not like a calculus teacher costs more. It's that they set the number of teachers you can have to teach sections, and that a certain number of sections, and they don't have enough students who can take the thing that this student wanted to take. And the thing that I think I'd love to understand your perspective on is, in my opinion, even for the high demand schools, the neighborhood schools, the selective, they set the number so high.
Oh, interesting. Uh-huh.
The number of students to be in a class, to fund a class that eventually funds a teacher, is so high that we can't even offer all the things it's like an impossible math problem. And I didn't know if you have that perspective or not, and that's just my teacher-centered world, but like the way they fund teachers, and it's this per pupil count, and even if it used to be different when I started, and I can't speak to all of it, but like it's so high that's why class sizes are so high. That's why COVID's a problem, because you have to cut the classes in half in Chicago, whereas like, that's my understanding. I could be wrong, so I'd love to know your information. You know, some suburban districts, their class sizes are so low, where then if you take the number of kids who actually aren't also going to participate in person, they can have their class be mostly whole. Whereas like the Chicago problem is, in some schools, the class sizes are so high that you have to cut the kids in half to try to get them in the building. I'd love to know what you know about these things, you know, like what you know about these things. I don't know. Like, so, and I don't mean to say like what I don't know what I know. Like,
no. I think it's always so valuable to have educators in on the discussion. And that's why in all of our coverage, we've really tried to prioritize the voices of people on the ground, be that educators, be it parents, be it students.
I love Chalkbeat. I love you. So don't worry.
Don't worry. Thank you. No, I think that's
so
a really,
happy you exist.
Oh, thank you. That's really nice. Cause sometimes I get a lot of really interesting phone calls.
I know. I love to hear everything, so it's okay. I'm going to be one of these people that it's okay if you criticize us. I'm okay with that.
No. I'm not. It's not a point of criticism, and your point is very well taken. It's not the cost of the calculus teacher. It's the math behind rationalizing the being of the existence, not your
the
very
existence of a class.
The existence of a class.
5
You're totally
students
right.
who could take it.
Absolutely.
They won't make a class for 5. Sometimes they won't even make a class for 20, which is what I think is amazing.
Right.
You know,
exactly. And you could. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and I don't know if people know that. And this is such a large math problem. What is Chicago Public Schools? And I hate that it comes down to that. So I wondered what other people know or think about. I mean, it's one giant money problem, which is what I think is amazing. And I'm sometimes not sure that it's considering students first.
It is a giant money problem. And you're absolutely right about that. I mean, when you look at the state and how we have historically funded education, I think that you really see some things come into stark view. And one is that until 2017, we essentially had the most regressive school funding formula in the entire country. And that means that Illinois had the largest gap between districts that have low property tax wealth and high property tax wealth. So when you calculated that on a per student basis in Illinois, we had districts that were paying $6,000 and $7,000 per student, and districts that were paying upwards of $30,000 per student. And at the end of the day, like that argument, it's just fundamentally flawed. And Chicago gets caught in the middle of that. We have a lot of property tax wealth, but we also have a lot of students with high needs. We have a lot of debt. I mean, I think we haven't even talked about debt. We have a lot of debt. Some of the money that goes to kids goes to debt. And so at the end of the day, it is a money problem. You're absolutely right about that. And I think going back to the example I gave, you can have a school like Peyton or, Lane Tech, where you do have enough students to make some sections, right? Obviously they're taking calculus, physics, but at a school that has 80 kids, you're never going to meet that number. Like, what are those kids, or a student ends up having the same math teacher for 4 years. I mean, you just end up with these sort of situations that you're like, wait, that for that student, you can see why the decision was made on paper, but for that student, what kind of education and what does that mean for that child's outcomes? And the story I told you, actually, the young woman did go to the U of C. She did end up being the first girl from her school to go to U of C. And she quickly realized once she got there, she didn't have the math background to follow the major she wanted, or to follow the course of study she wanted to take. And she actually didn't get to do what she wanted to do because she felt like so behind, which I think is just a really powerful story. I didn't really answer your question, Melanie, at all.
Okay. And I wondered if many people understand that math. I mean, it's a big math problem. So like, it's so hard, this
It's a
conversation
budget
about
funding problem. It's not a math problem, it's a budget problem.
yes.
It's a budget problem, but it's also
Math has a solution. Let's just be clear. Put more money in schools.
Yeah.
but it is also a priority issue, right? Like, you can increase the budget for anything, but then you have to determine how it's spent. And I think that then you have questions about, okay, well, we're siphoning off X amount for debt. We're siphoning X amount for pensions. We're spending X amount on priority, this priority versus that priority. And I think that those conversations in Chicago don't often happen in the public domain, in the public sphere, or if they do, they don't happen in a way that people understand them. They don't understand the choices that they have, or if they have any choices at all. And I won't soapbox you here, but I will say that as a parent, not as a journalist, as a parent, if I want to know more about these choices, what are my options? Am I going to go to the school board? Well, I didn't choose them. They don't have any. Am I going to go to my principal? My principal got handed this budget. They have a very narrow set of choices they get to make. Am I going to go to my local school council? Well, actually, they don't really have that much authority, it turns out, depending on the school. So I think that we've set up a system that people don't quite understand and also can't quite participate in.
And weirdly enough, and I feel like Mr. Pilshin brought this up, like certain schools that are in certain high demand and have certain amount of parents with a certain type of administration. I mean, I can say that our school was handing out devices and hotspots on March 17th. And I could say that my school, it's taken them time, but they've tried to get teachers adequately supported as well. And I mean, so that we can teach the students well. And I know that not every school is getting that, and that's an extra layer of inequity. You know what I mean? Like, that's an extra layer that maybe they're helping the students, and I'm not complaining, I'm saying, but like the poor teachers, I mean, nothing I've gotten, and I'm not trying to like put down the board at all. I'm not one to necessarily do that, but nothing I've gotten to help my students has directly come from CPS. It's come from my school. And that's what I think is complicated for the district as such a large district.
100%.
Cassie, do you think an elected school board, I struggle with the concept because I think it's become such like dogma and politicized, the debate over whether an elected school board. But as you're talking, I wonder if one benefit of an elected school board is that it might elevate these issues in the public sphere. If you have an election, you have to talk about it. But right now it's all the mayor and who she appoints. And if there's like 20 other issues, the mayor has to, gun violence and budgets and stuff, maybe the education part gets short shrift. An elected school board at least would force those issues into maybe give it more of a high profile. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I think there's pros and cons. As a journalist, I also can't take a position on it, but I do feel like we see in other markets, for example, in Denver, there's an elected school board. You saw initially charters raise a lot of money to get pro-charter advocates onto the board. And then you saw a shift where the teachers union raised more money to get teachers so they've become politicized as well. I don't think that they're a panacea. And I think the argument that Chicago can move quicker with some policy decisions because essentially it's mayoral control. You do see that play out in some sorts of areas. So it's a complicated thing. I will say that I do think that there are avenues for public participation in education that we just don't, I feel like we don't have. And I'm not sure that it's the elected school board, or maybe it's more empowerment to the LSCs. We're going into a school council election. The last two years ago, nearly half of the schools didn't even have enough people running to fill seats. I mean, certainly you have competitive elections at high profile schools. There's schools where it becomes a big deal, but there's schools, half of the schools it's not. And so I wonder about what are the ways that we can really increase access and also participation in the process and transparency in the process, finally.
Cassie, with your experience and exposure to the other desks, like, are we similar to New York and LA? Like, are we our own? Is it different? I mean, what's shared and what's different? You know, I've always been curious about that.
I mean, there are definitely things that are shared. I think the funding issues are, substantial. The equity issues, the achievement gap issues, we see those in other places, for sure. I do think the tension between the union and the district here, to me, feels like we're at a moment where that does feel special, or perhaps, I don't even know what the adjective is. More dramatic. That's not the right word. More polarized.
Yeah, polarized.
Yeah, I do see that. I do think the need of our students and the segregation of our city is a particular challenge. And when you look at neighborhood schools and you look at demographics and you look at who's able to apply for selective enrollment schools and move across the city and get there on time and do all of that, I think that is a sort of, maybe not unique facet, but that is something that definitely plays out in Chicago in a different way than it appears to me in other cities. But every city, there's issues in every city we cover. And I think that COVID has just taken the policy focus off of trying to address these issues, and it just becomes everybody's emergency all the time, necessarily so. But I wonder, when are we going to get back to the conversation about equitable school funding? When are we going to get back to the conversation about the elected school board IRA? Like, it should be a conversation, right? We should air out the pros and cons. Like, when are we going to get back to some of these discussions? Right now, it's pretty singularly focused is what it feels like.
Yeah,
Any other questions, comments?
The overall digital divide.
I'm sorry, Alan?
Just the overall digital divide. I mean, it's not just schools. We got the South and West Side with no broadband, period. I mean, it's crazy.
And I don't want to leave it on a gloom and doom note, but I will say I do think it will be interesting to also see, like, what are the things from this shift to virtual learning that would have taken districts years to plan out, right? Like, there was a 5-year plan to get devices in the hands of every student. CPS had to turn around and do it in 5 weeks, or try to do it in 5 weeks. What will the impacts, the lasting impacts on education? And Melanie, you probably have better thoughts on this than I do, but like, how will it change the practice of teaching? How will some of the organization and some of the things that have happened positively impact education? I mean, I think that there's room for that conversation as well. And I would stress that as,
I agree. I think one thing that maybe I hope people have had a good experience with is that they do want their child to have a in-person human teacher. And to actually think that, I'm saying that in the last 5 to 10 years, sometimes as a high school teacher, I often thought kids just thought they could just learn whatever they needed from a video and didn't have to pay attention to me. And I'm learning that most students want both, which I've always known that, actually, you know what I mean? Like, high school students want both. But I think in education, with this automation of life in the world, people wonder what jobs will get automated and which ones won't. And sometimes I think a positive experience from this, I could be wrong, Cassie, maybe. I have an 8-year-old, so I understand what you're talking about. But like, I think people are going to decide educators need to be humans, which is a good thing. I think
teachers matter. Yep.
Teachers matter, yeah.
I could be wrong, but I think they're gonna decide that children need to be with other children in person to be educated, I think. But I wonder if I think I actually heard a story on WBZ, I think it was last week, that talked about that there is a whole movement of people who have decided to be homeschoolers that might not have before, and they wonder if it will stick.
I think that's an interesting question.
There's also interesting models about, pods of 8, pods of 10, there's magic to those size of student loads. As you were talking about, Melanie, 30, 40, forget it. You can't learn anything with 30 or 40. You can learn a ton, because now each student can support each other, so there's some cool models going to emerge from that, I think.
So those are some of the things that I worry for, because Chicago public school grade schools in high demand are at 32. Like they'll fill the class to 32 because they can, which I know this is this whole other thing, and not to politicize, but I mean, this is why I believe a teachers union would want to try to reduce that class size, but that's one of the most expensive things you can do. But it's because.
But it's proven to work. That has data behind it. That is one of the few things in education with data. I taught a 32 class and a 24 class, same section, 1 year. And it was exponentially harder with the 32 than it was with the 24. Class size matters big time.
So those are interesting things, right?
I think we have to end now, just given the bandwidth of the church and the service and everything. So, but thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Cassie, for hanging on and answering all those questions. Thank you all for hanging on and listening. So
I hope it was useful.
It was very useful, and I think it was a good conclusion to the 3-part series that we've had, and I hope we continue to address these issues in this forum and others. So take care. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.